You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, Reform is building a bat tunnel of its own. But first, let's talk some shit about the reshuffle. So Martin, there was a reshuffle this week. It was big political news.
I mean, it's all quite boring, isn't it? It's basically the same government. We're just, switching some of the seats around. Someone goes to the foreign ministry, someone goes from there to somewhere else. It's sort of like transfer day, I guess, for football nerds, but for Westminster people. I mean, I don't want to play down your segment, James. I'm sure it's very entertaining and you've found a unique angle on it, but Jesus Christ.
Oh, Martin, we've got lots of listeners in Westminster. We need to pretend to be interested in, what's this politician saying? What does that mean for everything else? That sort of interpersonal drama. We should theoretically care about that.
I think they've got Rory Stewart for that and Alistair Campbell. I don't think we need to step on their toes.
Okay, that's fair enough, Martin, because I actually want to talk to you about something related to the reshuffle. Because this week, as fractious as it's been for the new government, I think there could be a really big opportunity here for Steve Reed, who just took over Angela Rayner's brief at the Department of Housing, Community and Local Government, MHCLG, the worst named department. I think there's a big opportunity for him to reverse Angela Rayner's worst mistake.
What's he going to do? Offer her tax advice?
Not quite, Martin. So to explain what this is about, we actually need to start by talking about a sewage treatment plant in Cambridge. But like promised, listeners, this will come back to some reshuffle chat.
Oh, you take us to all the most glamorous locations, James.
Yeah, so Martin, Cambridge, it's a very important city. It's home to one of our greatest universities, perhaps after only maybe Nottingham Trent or something like that. If you want to get the British economy growing, then Cambridge is pretty much at the centre of doing this. It's close to London, it's full of smart, highly skilled people, some big tech companies, it's on the new East-West rail line, it's going to connect directly to Oxford in the next few years, and, people have said for a long time now, Cambridge is a place which could quite easily expand. We could grow the city and basically build, I guess, something akin to our own Silicon Valley around the area, the Silicon Fen, as it's called. And so we need to grow Cambridge and make it more important.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a miniature Bedford, right, is my understanding. So it's not quite as successful as our city, but they do their best. They're up and coming. Maybe they'll get a theme park one day themselves. It's nice to see small rural places in the regions starting to develop a bit.
Absolutely, Martin. But there is a problem if we want to grow Cambridge to be this big, successful place, and that is sewage. Because if you're going to develop an area and increase the population, then more waste is going to be generated, and all that waste needs to be processed somewhere.
I feel like we're giving ammunition to all the people that say we talk shit on this podcast, James.
Absolutely, but I do think this is important because Cambridge has been basically hitting its sewage limit. In fact, because sewage capacity constraints are so tight in the city, Anglian Water, who manage the wastewater in the city, they've been, and this will infuriate everyone listening, 100% of people listening, they've been actively opposing new developments in the city because of sewage worries. Like there was a big redevelopment proposed of Cambridge Science Park, and Anglian Water said, oh no, don't do that because our sewage system won't be able to cope.
I mean, this is like we're living in the Victorian era, isn't it? It's like, we want to build some houses, but unfortunately we're going to have to pump all the shit into the river. Like what? How is that a thing in 2025 that you can't build, of all things, a science park because you haven't figured out how to deal with human waste?
Well, this is the thing. So they have been sort of trying to figure out how to do it.
Just put a bigger pipe in, for fuck's sakes.
Well, wait and see, Martin. So back in 2018, they first made plans for a new sewage treatment plant just outside of Cambridge. And the idea was this would serve a larger population, it would have more capacity than it does now. It would be out of town. It would be on greenbelt land in the countryside. But this would be good because the existing sewage works is in a part of the town's sort of urban core. And apparently it's quite stinky to live near. I can't say I've been round close to there myself, so I can't confirm this. But I've seen a map with like a dotted line around it that basically says it's stinky beyond this point, radiating out from the sewage works. So they want to build this new sewage works, and it ticks all of your 21st century boxes. It would be operationally net zero. It would be energy neutral. It's something to do with biogas. They can generate energy as as well as use energy. So over the course of a year, it'd be neutral. And they were even going to landscape it nicely to support wildlife. I mean, if you look at the image of this plan, and I put one on my Substack today if anyone wants to go and have a look at that, you actually look at it and think, that's quite an attractive sewage works.
Or, James, they could just all move to Bedford, which does not smell last time I checked and is not overflowing with human excrement.
That's on the sign, I think, isn't it?
I feel like we're not going to get the Cambridge Tourist Board sponsoring this podcast anytime soon.
Okay, Martin, so this plan gets even better, right? So they don't just want to build a new sewage works. I mentioned the existing sewage works. It's not quite in the middle of town, but it's like connected to the broader urban area of Cambridge. So you build the new sewage works and you close the old one, and suddenly there's a massive new brownfield site right there in Cambridge.
There certainly is if they can't fix the sewage soon. Tell me more about this brownfield, James.
Don't accuse us of Oxford bias, because I went to a state school and went to a polytechnic university. So this is just Martin being very rude about a very nice place. No. So if they built on this site of the old sewage works, they could build a whole sort of basically new district of the town there. It would be 10 minutes bike ride from Cambridge city centre. It'd be right next to Cambridge North railway station, which is a brand new train station that was opened in 2017. So it'd be really well connected. And the council came up with an entire plan for this district. They spent ages on it. It was going to be called Hartree. I think it's named after some sort of physicist who did something complicated involving electrons. I don't understand. But basically, you could have put 8,500 homes in the place where this existing sewage works was. About 90% of that would be flats. You could have, I think, 2 schools. There was going to be leisure facilities, health facilities, all the stuff you sort of need for a functioning town. And even better, my favourite thing about this plan for Hartree was that the architect who sort of master planned it, he said that he could make the whole thing basically car-free because it's a city location, which is good for all sorts of reasons. But the thing I like is he claimed in one article I read about this that Hartree wouldn't just be a 15-minute city, Martin. It would be a 5-minute city.
That's just trolling the conspiracy theorists at this point. It's like having seen the reputation of 15-minute cities. Yeah, let's just triple down on this. But no, it sounds fantastic. I guess if people can get over the constant stench in the air, it'll be a reasonably attractive place to live. Ticks a lot of boxes. They need lots of housing there. So this is the kind of development that's definitely going ahead, right?
Well, just to confirm, Martin, I think the stench comes from the sewage works, which will have closed down. It's not the people of Cambridge who stink themselves, however much you may think.
The sewage has to come from somewhere, James. I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Well, in any case, so is this happening? It's a funny story. So the development, they've spent 7 years now basically chugging through the planning system. So 2021, the government recognised how important this is strategically, so declared it a nationally significant project, and that took the planning powers away from the council. I think something we're very broadly supportive of on this podcast in a sort of generalised form. And they gave the powers to Westminster to finally decide whether to go ahead with it or not. They went and secured £277 million worth of investment cash from the government's housing infrastructure fund to help pay for the development, which I think was going to cost about 400 million quid overall. And then in 2025, earlier this year, last April, because this whole thing started as a sewage works, it actually fell to the Environment Secretary to finally approve building this whole thing, which he did in April this year, granting a development consent order, a DCO.
Fantastic. So essentially they've checked all the boxes, they've got all of their ducks in a row, and this should be going ahead, right?
And this is where we get back to the reshuffle and Angela Rayner, because only about 3 weeks ago, in her now former department, MHCLG, it made a pretty shocking announcement. They said that the 277 million quid, which looked like it had all been confirmed, was actually being pulled from the project because it was no longer considered value for money.
What the hell?
Yeah, so basically this decision caused the whole project to then collapse, and as a result, Cambridge Council and Anglian Water, they've issued a joint statement saying that the project will, quote, no longer be able to be delivered. So it looked like that Cambridge was basically screwed. But then, just the other day, as we saw, Angela Rayner resigned.
So, I mean, I'm confused on multiple levels, James. First of all, how Angela Rayner decided to pull this in the first place, but then now she's resigned. I guess, is that an opportunity for the decision to be reversed for whatever reason it was made?
Well, it might not change anything, Martin, but I think there's something notable about this reshuffle, right? So I can't help but wonder if Steve Reed, the new minister who's taken on MHCLG and took over Angela Rayner's portfolio, maybe he might want to revisit the decision and possibly reverse it and put up the cash after all. And why is this, you may ask, Martin? Well, it's because you remember how in April this year, the Environment Secretary previously approved the project? Well, the Environment Secretary at the time was some bloke called Steve Reed.
Amazing. So it all comes back to in a full circle. And I guess some YIMBY activists were the people that dug into Angela Rayner's tax affairs, perhaps? Is that how we ended up at this reshuffle?
I think that's a conspiracy we can start on this show, Martin, because it really does feel like fate, doesn't it? It feels like now Steve Reed can reinforce the decision that Steve Reed made not so long ago. Because as far as I can tell, and I want to stress with this, I am definitely not a lawyer. Do not take legal advice from me here. But I don't think there are any legal barriers to reversing the decision, even though it sounds like the decision has already been made, because the planning permission granted back in April by Steve Reed, that remains valid for a few more years. So I presume if the cash can be found, if MHCLG will say, here's your 277 million quid, then suddenly we could start this thing getting built and start the new sewage works and build this new district of Cambridge.
Okay, but presumably there was a reason why Angela Rayner canned this in the first place suddenly. So is there not a risk that the same thing could happen with Steve Reed? Are they going to get to him as well?
Well, I'd love to say that the story ends here, that, Steve Reed can do the right thing and it's a piece of cake. He just has to sign a piece of paper and problem solved. But I do think it is more complicated because I'm a careful, nuanced guy, I've got to say that. So basically, the reason the decision appears to have been made, and this is slightly more speculative on my part because we don't know the exact reasons it was made. People have tried to FOI the business case for the sewage works over the years, and they've been denied. The last time, I think it was 2023, when some people tried to get hold of it. But basically, whenever the government makes a decision like this, there's a value for money calculation. And the argument appears to have been MHCLG has decided it's not value for money anymore because everything's got more expensive. So the project's going to cost more money. Exactly how much more money, we don't know. But at least they put out a statement saying materials and labour have got more expensive, blah, 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 supply chain drama, all the usual stuff. And what makes this more complicated, and maybe not entirely Angela Rayner's fault, maybe I'm being a bit unfair or a bit trying to, shock jock my way to get people to listen here, because I think it's ultimately the Treasury that holds the purse strings on the Housing Infrastructure Fund. So it could be their sort of calculation that decides whether it's something counts as value for money or not.
Talking about value for money now, James, I have a horrible feeling that the phrase Treasury brain is about to come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is me again. I'm mostly speculating here, but I dare say this is some reasonably well-informed speculation because it does seem to be Treasury brain, the idea that someone in the Treasury is only making decisions by looking at the spreadsheet and the numbers. The Treasury loves saying no to stuff because they're incentivized to only look for reasons to save money rather than the sort of bigger picture stuff like why spending money might actually work out better in the long run. And my assumption here is that because of the cost of the building the new sewage works has increased, someone plugged the new numbers into the equation and basically computer said no. And I just think that this is crazy. I mean, the Green Book, which is the Treasury document which sort of sets out how value for money is calculated, there was a review of it a few years ago where it basically said it needs to take more strategic stuff into account, and that could be underweighted relative to sort of bean counting. And like I said at the beginning of this segment, this is a really important strategic place. Cambridge is a critical place if we want to get the economy growing. If we want Cambridge to grow, we need more homes, we need more workplaces, we need more sewage treatment. And so even if this does get quite expensive in terms of what it would cost to build a sewage works, if you think about the potential for what Cambridge could do for Britain, we really do need to build this. So I wonder if the value for money calculation has gone completely askew here. And the last thing I'll say on this is the good news is I think theoretically, if the politicians decide that this is important, as per my argument, I think they can override the Green Book. Basically, the problem at the moment is because you're going against what the computer says, you seem like you're going out on a limb. You have to take a bit of a political risk. But, now Steve Reed's in place, and given that he's aware of the importance of this scheme, previously as Environment Secretary, he was saying, build it on the green belt. Therefore, he must have thought, this is actually pretty important, given how politically fraught that would be. Then maybe he'll take the political risk and finally get this sewage works built.
Yeah, and maybe one day Cambridge will catch up with Bedford. Who knows? But I think, James, you've not entirely convinced me that reshuffles matter. It might matter. I guess we'll find out. So, James, two of our favourite topics on this podcast. One of them is bat tunnels. Of course, we're big fans of bat tunnels, at least from a content perspective. And the other is how institutions seem to be conspiring and working their hardest to elect a reform government in 2029 through
We're a cheery pod, Martin.
Exactly. We like to keep you entertained on a Monday morning. So here's a story that neatly combines both of these things because, James, it turns out that a reform-led council in Lincolnshire is actually building a bat tunnel, much to their own surprise, and they're really not very happy about it.
Is this one of those reform councils that's like led by a 12-year-old or something who's been put in charge of enormous like social care budgets they don't understand?
No, I think it's actually run by an adult. He's called Sean Matthews, and according to the footage that I've seen, at least he looks like a reasonably old man, although, you never know. But essentially, the project in question is called the North Hykeham Relief Road, which confusingly is a £200 million dual carriageway that's being built to the south of Lincoln. And it got funded by Labour in part due to their big infrastructure push earlier this year. Government's paying about half of it and the council are chipping in another 75 million or so. So it's a pretty massive project for Lincolnshire County Council. Now, the great philosopher Beyonce once said, if you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. And that's exactly what Lincolnshire County Council are trying to do with this road. For over 2 decades, they've been trying to build a ring road around their city in order to reduce traffic and congestion in various suburbs and allow vehicles to move from places like Skegness and other towns around Lincoln. And the North Hykeham Relief Road, it's like the very last section of it. Once they've built it, they've actually completed transport in Lincoln. It's literally the last major piece of infrastructure on their local transport plan.
Martin, we've covered Lincolnshire's infrastructure needs a lot on this podcast. There's someone in Lincolnshire listening. He must be delighted that this pod is specifically for them. But Martin, from what you're saying, I'm guessing that something must have gone horribly wrong because you say they're now building a bat tunnel. And we know from HS2 that those are pretty bad. So what's happened?
Yeah, the bat tunnel is the final level of all infrastructure, I think. And what happened in this case is sometime in 2023, a man in a field holding an acoustic receiver detected a bat. And it wasn't just any bat, it was a Barber-style bat. And now I have lots of thoughts on how these surveys are done, and I'm elaborating on them in the Substack post that is coming out at the same time as this podcast. So there's a little plug for that. But assuming that these surveys are accurate, this is a really big deal. So there are 17 species of bats in the UK, James. I appreciate our listeners aren't tuning in for an ecology discussion or lecture, but just for context. 2 of those bat species are especially rare and they're subject to very, very strict protections. And one of those is the Barber-style bat. And this is a particularly gnarly bat because it's already been responsible for a bypass being cancelled in Norwich, which was pretty bad news for Alan Partridge, obviously.
Sorry, the entire road was completely cancelled because of a bat?
Almost, yeah. So the Norwich bypass was in the works for years. Much like Lincolnshire, they had massive ambitions to build bypasses around Norwich to improve traffic. This was a crucial piece of that, and they were in consultation with Natural England for nearly 4 years. When suddenly in March last year, the rules on this specific bat were changed. It was given much more protection by Natural England. And it turns out there's a colony of them on the route that the road is supposed to take. And so suddenly, after literally 4 years of talking to Natural England, the council had just told in March, nope, actually you can't do it. And in January this year, they had to finally withdraw the plans. Now, they've been able to bring them back to the table since. So they're getting it going again, and hopefully the road will still go ahead. But they're now 5 years into this saga of trying to figure out how to basically deal with this bat.
Martin, you're making me think, why do Al-Qaeda bother trying to kill people? Why don't they just get a whole bunch of bats and just release them and paralyze us that way and try to achieve their aims that way? But
yeah, I think if the Russians just introduced a new rare bat species, they'd cause havoc across the kingdom.
Okay, Martin, so this is obviously an insane story. So I guess if you're a developer on any other road, then you're going to be pretty paranoid about bats being a problem.
Right, exactly. So the development in Lincolnshire, the North Hycombe Relief Road, is being led by the Highways Department at Lincolnshire County Council. And obviously, they're going to want to talk to Natural England as early as possible and make sure that they've got everything squared away, which is what they did. And allegedly, this is what resulted in the requirement for a bat tunnel and a bat bridge, James, on the road.
Hang on, Martin, what did you mean by allegedly there? I just want to emphasise for any lawyers listening, Martin made this allegation and I definitely did not.
Well, but this is where it gets really weird because both the Reform Council leader and the Conservative opposition leader point the finger squarely at Natural England. They say that Natural England were responsible for this advice and for essentially coming up with this necessity for a bat bridge and a bat tunnel. But when the BBC asked Natural England, they said they've got nothing to do with the proposal. They'd not offered any advice. The developer came up with the plans themselves based on ecological surveys, and Natural England, we were never consulted. And now that's a little bit awkward because the developer in this case, as I say, is Lincolnshire Highways Department. And here's Sam Richards, who is the head of the Highways Department, talking about the process at a recent council meeting.
So we spoke to Natural England rather than trying to sort of go with it. We actually spoke to the people as part of the process to say, what is the reasonable level of mitigation? Obviously, you go into that with a level of trepidation when you see some of the things that I'm sure we've all seen in the press with the HS2 and £1 billion on the bat tunnel of, are we getting into this kind of process? I have to say the conversation was far more pragmatic and proportionate to the flight paths that we have. We actually have 5 or 6 flight paths at different locations across the route, and each of them having slightly different mitigation depending on the intensity.
Martin, this is just making me more confused.
Yeah, exactly. So, we don't have lawyers on this podcast, so I'm not going to start speculating about motives or, why people have responded the way that they did. But there's clearly a discrepancy here between what the Highways Department, who, just to remind listeners that these are not political people. This is effectively the local civil servants who are working on this. They're professionals. They're used to kind of doing this stuff and working with bodies like Natural England. And they say they've consulted with Natural England, and Natural England are saying, nope, we don't know anything about it. So God knows what's going on there. But what at least is clear is that unless they do something about the bats to help protect bats that are around the road is not going to go ahead.
So what's the plan, Martin? I guess importantly, is building this bat tunnel, which I'm sure Reform are loving. What is it going to cost?
So the plan, as I say, is for a bat green bridge and a bat tunnel to be built. And it's fair to say that the idea of a bat bridge and a bat tunnel have challenged the imagination of the new councillors. Here's the Conservative opposition leader trying to wrap his head around the projects in the same council meeting.
I'd also like to know, in terms of the remedial measures you've been asked to put in, I'm assuming by Natural England, one of the great Tony Blair legacy arrangements, I'm guessing we don't have any choice, that we either have to do what they say or they will just stop this scheme going ahead. But what's the measure of effectiveness of these things? I mean, how do you, dare I ask, direct a bat through a tunnel? I mean, I can't even believe I'm asking the question, candidly. But I think it should be asked with respect.
Traffic lights.
I mean, you can't put up a sign because maybe Braille. I don't know. But they can't see, can they? So
Thanks to Councillor Davis.
Sorry.
I'll let that. If you can answer that question, you'd be doing well.
Martin, it's weirdly fascinating how, despite Reform being in charge of the council and having beaten them, and the Conservatives are now in opposition, they seem basically to completely agree on all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of striking that they're all sort of having a laugh together. And I think one thing I find quite fascinating about this is I can't help thinking it speaks to Reform having a much better media operation than the Tories. So the Tories were dealing with exactly the same issues for the last year or so. But it's the new Reform councillors who've managed to highlight this and are making a big noise and bringing this to the attention of the BBC. And I really think that says something about how well they're doing on a campaigning front. But anyway, leaving that aside, the bat tunnel is a bit misleading. So what these actually are an underpass and an overpass for hedgerows. So the point here is that bats navigate along hedgerows. If you imagine at night, like if you're looking at the ground from up in the air, there's all the sort of pale fields, and between them there's these dark lines of hedgerows, and that's what bats follow when they're moving around and trying to hunt stuff. And if you imagine a big dual carriageway or a road that's sort of cutting through a hedgerow and severing it in the middle, the bats are obviously going to fly along the hedgerow at quite a low level, and then they're going to hit the gap, and then they're going to go splat into the side of a lorry or something. So it's not ideal. So the idea here is that you make like a little bridge or a culvert, and the hedge basically just continues over or under the road. The bats follow it as usual, in theory, and everything's fine, except it's going to cost you about £4.3 million to answer your question.
Martin, am I crazy, or does that not actually sound too bad in terms of money? I mean, 4.3 million out of a budget of, what did you say, 200 million for the road? That's basically a rounding error, and this is a nice thing to do for the bats.
Yeah, and not just for the bats, right? I mean, I'm kind of in favor of this in general. Like, hedgerows are massively important for wildlife. I know where you live, James, in urban reaches of Greater London, you don't really have wildlife or countryside or ever see anything green. But here in the countryside, we understand that there is a thing called wildlife. It moves around. It needs to get from A to B, and hedgerows are a great way for it to do that. And they're important for connecting different ecosystems and stopping Britain's land from being completely fragmented to nature. And so I'm kind of in favor of them, but that's not why they're being built. They're being built for a specific species of bat. And that's where I think we come to the next problem, James.
Let me guess. Do these species of bats, do they not like bat tunnels or bat hedgerows or whatever we're calling them now?
So, yeah, let's come to the question of, do these actually work? This is the £4 million question, right? So earlier I mentioned Norwich. Norwich have been wrestling with bats for years now. It seems to be a weird thing in Norwich that basically they're the front line of the war with the Barber-style bats, maybe because they're closest to Russia. Who knows? But conspiracy theories aside, so recently Norfolk County Council installed bat bridges and other bat infrastructure. They built gantries over an A road at a cost of £1 million that were designed that bats would kind of think that they were a hedgerow and follow them. And a report was leaked to the BBC recently that showed that the bats basically ignored them completely. One green bridge that they built, they did surveys there. They had sightings of just 13 bats, 13 bats. And in fact, a lot of this was put in place again because of the Barber-style bats that they were most concerned about. And the colony of those that were there just moved out of the area, apparently.
So is this like when I buy my cats a lovely new cat tree to stand on or play with, and they don't care and they just want to sit in the old plastic bag instead, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like however much money you've spent on it, completely wasted because they'd rather just jump in a cardboard box or something. And here's the thing, right? So these bats hate noise and light and human disruption. They are famously elusive. Yeah, exactly. Me too, right? Perhaps unlike you, they're much happier in quiet, peaceful woodland. I feel like that's a bit of a stretch, not really our natural environment. But so why would they be going near a busy 70-mile-an-hour dual carriageway full of bright headlights in the first place?
So there's basically no way to mitigate the harm to these bats from building this road then, is what you're saying?
Well, there kind of is, and it comes back to what Yimbys have been saying about bat tunnels and other wildlife preserving infrastructure all along, which is if you want to spend £4 million or £10 million or £100 million specifically to conserve a species of bats like the Barber-styles, you would be much better off investing it in a proper conservation effort, doing something like building £4 million worth of woodlands that they can actually live in and that provides habitat and roosting spots and restoring hedgerows across the countryside and so on. That would make much more sense than building green bridges across random sections of A road, even though, like I said, in general, I'm still very much in favour of preserving hedgerows where possible, right?
And I guess what you're saying as well, that this is basically a massive gift for reform. If a council can't build a road because of some bats, well, that's just going straight on the poster, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's incredible. So not only have Natural England made themselves the villain yet again with both the original policy and also the communication around it, which is wildly confusing, but they're painting a massive target on their backs if reform ever managed to take power in Westminster. So the council leader there, Sean Matthews, is already talking about getting the local MP to raise this issue in Parliament. It's clearly something that they're able to campaign on and make a big noise about. It's the perfect exemplar for them of bureaucracy gone mad and Britain drowning in red tape and we can't even build a road anymore. And I think we sort of underestimate the possibility that if Reform take power, they could do quite drastic things with very few checks and balances on them, right? So they could just defund Natural England completely and disband the organisation and remove a whole bunch of those environmental protections. And I think if Westminster pundits could get away from doing pointless reporting on reshuffles that don't really matter other than to the people involved, and they actually look outside the M25 a bit, they'd see that this is the playbook that is being written now for if or when Reform take power. And it is a very effective playbook at getting media attention, much more effective than the Tories were up there previously. And as much as I know we criticise Natural England, they do exist for a reason. There is a purpose. Like, we should want to protect bats. We should want to protect wildlife when we build new infrastructure. And it's great that we consider things like green corridors and hedgerows when we're putting down new roads and new railways. I know often the criticism of the abundance agenda is, you just want to build stuff everywhere and you don't care about regulations or the environment. But I think what we've always said is actually the current system is not great for protecting those things anyway. And we can do a lot better, not just for building stuff, but for bats and, dare I say, other animals, whatever they may be as well. But we're stuck with this system that is insane. It is horrendously opaque. It's very hard to find actually detailed information even on what surveys were done or what bats were found. Developers are stuck in this sort of constant state of fear and uncertainty where every time they have a meeting, it might lead to a 3-year delay, and it doesn't necessarily protect the bats anyway. And I think the danger is that unless there is a much needed reform of quangos like Natural England and how they operate and the culture there, going beyond the planning reforms that we've seen so far, we could just see wholesale destruction of environmental protection in a few years' time if Reform take power, and that would be a really bad thing.
Well, that's a depressing note to end on, Martin. Let's hope that the next segment is a bit cheerier. So before we get to our interview this week, Martin, let's do some quick housekeeping. So if you're enjoying the Abundance Agenda, make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app, and please go there now. Give us 5 stars. Feed our enormous egos and tell us if you're enjoying the show so that we keep making it. And tell your friends. Post it on social media. Send them a WhatsApp saying, hey, you're a nerd. You're in this demographic of the sort of people who listen to this sort of thing. Have a listen to this show. You'll probably like it.
Yeah, or go out into the streets and shout at people driving past in their cars, and whatever you can do is going to help. Subscribe twice. Like, get 2 different phones. Get an Android phone and an Apple phone, and subscribe on both podcast services. Like, every little bit helps us.
It's all good advice. But Martin, in addition to doing this podcast, we also write our own Substack newsletters. What have you been writing about this week?
So I've been writing more about the Bat Tunnel. So if you want a slightly deeper dive into that, or you just hate the sound of our voices and would rather read it, go and take a look. It's a fun little Substack. And what about you, James? Are you writing?
Yeah, I've been writing quite a lot recently. So I also, like you, I have doubled up on my segment this week. I've not just spoke about it on the pods, but I've also written a piece to accompany this about the Cambridge sewage works and what can be done there. But last week, I also published a big piece, basically examining some ideas from a slightly fringy campaign group called Fare Free London, who want to remove all the ticket costs on London transport. I took their ideas seriously and worked out whether it could work or not. And here's the twist. I came out slightly more left-wing than I did going in. But anyway, you can read that on my Substack and find links to Martin's Substack, both on abundancepod.com. But for now, let's get to this week's guest. Martin, who are we talking to this week?
So this week we have Alicia Greated, who is Executive Director at CASE, the Campaign for Science and Engineering. In recent months, they've had a couple of really interesting reports out. One has been looking into Britain's industrial strategy and how are we doing in areas like AI or industrial robotics or life sciences or other kind of high-tech science and engineering-led industries. And so they have a lot of interesting thoughts about that. And then the other fascinating piece of research they've been doing is on attitudes to immigration among voters, including reform voters, but particularly where it relates to academics and experts coming into the UK. And I think some of the things that they found are quite surprising, maybe challenge people's notions of what reform voters are actually like. And so we thought it would be really interesting to have a chat with Alicia, and you can hear that now. So today we're joined by Alicia Greated, the Executive Director at CASE, which is the Campaign for Science and Engineering, a charity which campaigns on the importance of research and development across the public and private sectors to economic growth in the UK, which is a topic that we're obviously very keen on. I won't insult your intelligence or the intelligence of our listeners by asking why R&D is important to economic growth. I think we could probably get past that a little bit for our podcast. But recently you've published an interesting paper on the topic of supporting immigration for research and development in the UK. And I thought we could start just by asking, how did that topic come about? How did it become salient to CASE, and what was your aim in putting that forward?
So first of all, Martin and James, thank you very much for having me, and great overview of CASE. So it means I don't need to do that. In terms of immigration, so just to add to your description of what CASE is, we are a charity and we're supported by this very broad membership of universities, businesses, charities, professional bodies. And the reason I mention that is we cover a whole range of organisations that both do and rely on research and development. And for them, the skills that they have are critical, and also the process of doing research itself is critical. And for both of those, we need international talent. So research, I think some of your listeners probably do research, but the process of research requires international collaboration. And we know that the quality of research improves the more collaboration we do in a lot of cases. But also we have big skills gaps in the UK. In some cases, we want to fill those ourselves domestically. And in that interim, we need to be filling those gaps with highly qualified people. So there's lots of reasons for our members absolutely needing the visa system and the immigration to support the best quality people around the world coming to the UK.
So let's imagine for a moment that I'm an extremely capable and intelligent and bright person, which might be a little bit of a stretch. And I'm in some other part of the world and I want to come to the United Kingdom. I'm interested in bringing my skills here, despite the terrible weather and everything else, taking up a new job. What are some of the barriers or the difficulties or expenses that either I'm being hit with, or the company or organization that I'm trying to work for is being hit with?
So I don't know your circumstances in your imaginary role, but let's imagine that you have a partner and children, for example. So you will obviously, if you're coming to work in a lab or some department in the UK, you'll want to bring your family. So at the moment, for a family of 4, your family to come to the UK, just the upfront cost, I don't mean a cost spread out over several years, but the upfront cost for your family to come to the UK would be over £20,000. And I think for anyone, it doesn't matter what you're getting paid, but certainly most researcher salaries, and it's not just the individual, it's the institution that has to cover that cost potentially. So that's a really large figure. And the second point relating to that is that figure is a lot higher than other countries that we might gauge ourselves against as the UK. So we've done lots of work on this, and as have several bodies in the UK, but the Royal Society did some really good work looking at relative costs for you in your brilliant role to come to the UK.
And my children, apparently,
and your
that
children.
I now have.
You've got a very fabulous family. And if we compare ourselves to other research-intensive countries, and they would be countries like the US or Canada, France, we are charging 17 times the average of those countries, which is not good. So just to add to that, though, there's lots of warm words. If you look at the industrial strategy or the terminology around the spending review or any of the government announcement, there are definitely warm words that have the phrase global talent all of them. So we do have initiatives that are good happening, but those upfront costs are a really big barrier to people coming to the UK, and it's a real problem.
And obviously we have our famously cheap housing and associated other kind of costs and barriers just from other kinds of circumstances. I think one interesting theme in that report as well was that, kind of reading between the lines, it seems like it's actually quite hard to build a sort of general picture of what it's like? You've obviously given a really good example there, but there are lots of different situations and scenarios, different types of organization. Is it quite difficult to build that picture? And if it's difficult for you, is it also quite difficult for government, I guess, to understand the impacts of policies?
I think that's also a really important point. And part of that is people always don't want to share their bad stories because we want to attract people to the UK. So a university isn't going to necessarily, or a company isn't going to brand around its awful experiences because they want to show themselves as an attractive destination. It's really hard to get hold of that information. And also we can't carry it out as a scientific experiment because we don't have anything to compare it to. We are actually conducting some work at the moment. Well, we're doing lots of work around this, but one of the activities we're doing is we are conducting one-to-one interviews with professionals like HR professionals, for example, who are actually working one-to-one with people who want to come to the UK and dealing with the visa process and trying to dig down into the specifics of what is challenging through that process. But it is hard to come by that overall picture as you describe.
And I guess you're working, I think, with the Centre for British Progress on this. And I guess the aim there is to really build that picture and play it back to government to sort of challenge them a bit on, okay, these are the issues. How are you going to address that and sort of come beyond some of that rhetoric around global talent?
Well, you've just used the term rhetoric around global talent, and I'll lead into, like a politician does, into a question I'm really interested in, is around, we've obviously got this ongoing national debate, you can call it, around immigration. And I would use the term polarised views around immigration, but it's a very hot topic at the moment. And the other piece of work we're doing is around public opinion towards immigration. Because at the moment, I think we've got quite a black and white narrative around that, which is really unhelpful because actually, if you do go out to the public, the view's quite nuanced. The public, whatever their views are on the spectrum of immigration views, most people do want skilled workers to come in and, for example, researchers to come into universities or businesses to enhance our R&D system. However, as a sector, we've not been successful in getting that message across. So we're doing some really interesting work that we've just kicked off at the moment, which is around how do we create a narrative based on really strong evidence and good research about the public's opinion. How do we create a narrative and a really compelling message both to politicians and to the public about the importance of highly qualified people coming to the UK and the value and importance of them in our R&D system and therefore our economy and therefore benefiting all of our lives and livelihoods.
Exactly. So there is a perceived backlash against immigration in recent years. And I say perceived because I think exactly as you say, there's a very black and white sort of tone to the debate in the sense that to listen to a lot of the political response to this, it's almost like a state of panic. Like there's this kind of furious backlash and we must immediately clamp down on everything. I think what's kind of interesting, you've obviously looked very closely at public opinion. How does that match up with the kinds of caricatures that people have? So people, will talk about reform voters, for example, and will say that essentially they're all closed-minded. They don't like foreigners. They don't want immigration. But is that actually borne out in the kinds of research that you're doing, or is that they're actually a very different story there?
So there's 2 points I'd like to make. I think the first one is that general question about what is happening in the political landscape in terms of the move. I don't know what terminology is acceptable, but to the right and or the populist vote and how that'll impact on attitudes towards research, attitudes towards organisations that do research like universities, because we know there's all the woke sort of narrative around that, and how much of that is perceived and how much of that is reality. So we are doing some work around, because we love to assume things and think we're very right, whether we're Guardian readers or Daily Mail readers. So I think having strong evidence around that political landscape and what it means for the type of question that you're asking is really important. So we're kicking off some work around that very soon. But I just wanted to pick up on the point you make about, you use the word perceived, which is really important. So CASE, our organisation is really proud and our members really value this, that all the work we put out is based on very strong evidence. We're quite careful what we put out in the public. And the public opinion work we've been doing is based on really thorough. We've polled like 35,000 people now. We've done loads of different studies. But the perception bit's really interesting. So we would have assumed, for example, in terms of support for R&D, we would have assumed that the younger people in society would have been more supportive of R&D. And that is not borne out with our evidence so far. And we've got interesting dynamics with gender, socioeconomic group. So I'm just saying the perceptions and the reality, we've absolutely got to focus on the reality and then create a really strong narrative and messaging around that, whether it's for politicians or the public.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Even having gone through it, I hadn't realised that point about younger people not necessarily being more supportive of R&D. Yeah. Is that sort of the very youngest kind of cohorts, or is it a
no,
spread?
It's under you might fit into the young people. It's under 44 age group, but in the next few years, well, we've just kicked off this work. We're going to be doing like a tracker, so we're looking at trends. So every 3 years, we'll be doing a poll building on previous questions, so we can look at those trends, whether it's age, whether it's your voting lean, whether it's your gender, and also where you live. So we've done analysis at a constituency level. That's really interesting as well, because there are differences across the country. And that's obviously really relevant when we try and speak to politicians, because if we can show them constituency data, which we did do in the election last year, it's super powerful. Because if you can say your constituents, I don't know, really value the role of R&D to bring jobs into the community, or would like to see a lab on their high street, or want to see you go out and visit universities or R&D institutions like that, that's really powerful.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. We've had Alistair Stratton, who happens to be my MP, on recently, and that need to sort of take MPs sometimes away from those big national narratives and help them to focus on what's important in their constituency and kind of filter out some of that noise is incredibly important.
And what we found that was interesting relating to your last point is around the general election, first of all, we contacted all the potential parliamentary candidates. That was like 4,000 people. But we also created quite a tailored pack. Not quite a tailored pack, it was a tailored pack with constituency level data and case studies and things for each new MP. But what we found in that process, actually, when we got the feedback from those bits of work, that quite a lot of the feedback we got was from the Reform Party. So that was quite interesting. So we definitely want to dig down into that, and as ideas and policies evolve, be part of influencing that in an informed way.
So coming on to that influencing side of things, so obviously I think you're in the process of building messaging based on the results that you've seen. What are some of the things that you're looking at there? I know it's quite sort of early days, but are there any interesting sort of revelations or ideas or thoughts that you've had in that direction about how you bring that kind of message to different audiences?
I think what we're seeing emerging, I mean, that's ongoing work, but the two elements that are very important for the public and actually politicians as well is around purpose. This might sound really obvious, but making sure that when we talk about research and development, that it's got a real impact on the purpose of your life. So areas that might be easier to do that in might be cancer research or some environmental research. But the other area that's really interesting, and it relates to a lot of the policy that's coming out of government, is around place and local innovation and local R&D activities that bring jobs or bring income to people's communities. And that is very important for voters and very important for politicians. So they are areas that we're looking closely at and do much more work in how we generate those narratives.
So essentially, kind of how do people gain pride in their local area or community based on the kind of research they're doing? Which leads me quite nicely into my next question, actually, which is coming on a little bit more to the industrial strategy side of things. The current mood, I would say, in the UK is a little bit down at times around how we're performing, the economy, all these sorts of things. But if we were to bring a touch of positivity back, what makes the UK such a strong contender in R&D? Why are we able to kind of punch above our weight in a number of areas, like the life sciences, for example?
There's lots of answers to that, but historically, we have always been extremely strong at many areas of research and therefore very strong in development and innovation and bringing that into products that can benefit lives. And the life science is a really good example, and people love to go and then talk about COVID and vaccines and things, which is obviously the UK played a key role in that. What I would say, if you go to that negative narrative, if we take vaccines as an example, we've got this narrative that the UK is amazing at research, but then we lose all the value of the research because it goes and gets commercialised elsewhere, which in some areas there's definitely some truth to that. However, we've done a piece of work that we published recently with the British Academy in partnership with them. And if you take vaccines as an example, that's an area where we're brilliant. We've got a brilliant research base in aspects of vaccine technology. Some of that's commercialised in the UK, but some of it isn't. But what we've been talking about is that process. You've got research, you've got commercialisation, but you've also got adoption. And by that, I mean using the products or the service. And I think we need to make sure that we get really good at adopting those products or services, and in that case, vaccine technology, wherever it's coming from, even if it isn't commercialised in the UK, because that then has an impact on our productivity, it has an impact on the health of our workforce. So looking at that whole process rather than just saying we're brilliant at research, we might not always commercialise it well, and then there's a full stop. We need to be looking at that whole process and how it varies in different sectors as well.
So the adoption's really interesting because I think, as you say, we regard ourselves as having a very strong research base in a number of areas. So AI would be another one, industrial robotics, for example. We have a really strong VC community. I was going to say in the UK, I'd say particularly around London, but in the UK generally. But then often in some of these areas, we do run into problems. So I think what was interesting about your industrial strategies plural report was kind of breaking it down into those areas and starting to look at them individually. But is adoption a kind of cross-cutting theme across a number of those areas? And if so, is there any sort of commonality to that? Like, is it an economic thing? Is it sort of how we do business here? Are there other sort of factors playing into it? Or is it really sector by sector?
It is sector by sector, but we've got a table in our report which shows RAG, which is like red, amber, green, like how good you are at things, going from research, commercialisation, adoption. And if you look very crudely at that, I would say research is like big, shiny green, and then it gets a little bit more amber as you go through. However, it definitely does vary between sectors. And if you take something like AI, we've had this enormous, I think we've had over 8 billion investment from venture capitalists in the UK over the last 4 years, which is brilliant. And we've got this really strong research base that the government's supporting. The adoption part is really complex though, because when you look at AI, it hits, taking that as an example, it has impacts on a whole range of sectors. Internationally, we've got enormous competition. So what we need to be doing, again, is looking holistically at the whole process of adoption. And that involves things like the regulation system, which is something we've been doing quite a lot of work on. And with AI, that's really complex because you have to have regulation, but you don't want it to be so tight that you don't do anything. But the other aspects are not as tangible. So they could be aspects like the culture of the civil service, for example, or the culture of the government to procure innovation or technologies that we've produced in the UK. And that cultural part is quite hard to define. You can't put pound signs against it, but it's critical in terms of supporting some of our companies being able to commercialise and then have their technologies or their ideas adopted in the UK system. And the government's aware of that. And I think we've definitely seen some moves towards progressing that. But AI is relatively early on compared to some of the other sectors that we looked at.
Yeah, the regulatory piece around AI is fascinating. So previously I've worked in health tech, including for some slightly notorious health tech companies. But one of the challenges that we had to deal with was that the kind of regulation that existed wasn't really ever designed to cover some of those more far-reaching applications of AI in areas like clinical practice or medicine. And so you had to have a constant, almost negotiation with the regulator. It's not as simple as here are some black and white rules that we're going to follow. It's we need to have an ongoing dialogue and try to do the things that we think make sense and be talking constantly to see that, yes, we are trying to do this in good faith and we're working together towards a solution. So I guess robust regulators that have the expertise is going to be a key thing there as well, right?
Yeah, and the capability. I mean, if you continue with that example of AI, I mean, the creative industries, that is an absolute minefield. And you could take healthcare, you could almost take any sector, and AI is relevant to that sector, and the issues are complex in all of those. So we've looked at regulation at one of the areas that really impacts on commercialization and adoption. And there are lots of different important aspects of that we need to consider. One is around capability, as you've just described. We actually need the numbers of people and the expertise to have those types of discussion, but also it's mechanisms to try things out. We don't want the regulation to stop the innovation from progressing. And there are, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but there are models that have been used in other sectors. I think they're called sandboxes, where you can test regulatory ideas out and then apply them. We'll test them in a safer environment and then apply them in the wider environment. So regulation is one example of an area that we really need to focus on.
So something else that you touch on there is kind of bringing disciplines together. So I think you give the examples of AI and industrial robotics, where you could sort of see more collaboration between the two in trying to bring these things to market and get them to adoption. We've had various sort of efforts to promote that kind of thinking in the UK recently. Obviously, we've seen issues around things like the Turing Institute that's kind of run into problems in recent months and years, and perhaps tried to do that at one point, but not necessarily very successfully, as some would argue. Are we lacking the sort of institutions to foster that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration? And, you know, immediately I'm thinking of things like the Santa Fe Institute in the United States, which is very famous for bringing people in from lots of different areas. Are we lacking a little bit of that, either the institutional support or the culture for that here?
I'm pausing a bit because collaboration is such a big topic, and I think it starts very early on in the fundamental research journey. It goes through innovation. It goes through the whole process of R&D and adoption. So, and then there are benefits throughout each of those stages. I think the issue we have with collaboration is it's seen quite a soft term, and we often don't put the money or time or environment aside to support that process. And I think that's an ongoing challenge for everybody, to be honest. What I would say, this is a personal view, this isn't a case view, but culture and behaviours in any environment and how you encourage people to feel safe and confident to be able to talk about their work in a way that might not feel natural with other collaborators is really, really important. So culture is a critical part of that process. It's not just money, it's not just time, it's leadership, culture, and how you support that. And I think that runs through any organisation and any sort of collaboration, not even just in R&D, in any area.
Alicia Greated, it's been a delight. Thank you very much.
Martin, that's just about it for another week. So yeah, how do you think it's gone?
It's gone like a bass house of hell, James.
Excellent. So like I say, if you've enjoyed the show, give us 5 stars on the pod, tell your friends, promote us. We should probably have a better outro than this. Just we're tired now. So tune in next week. In the meantime, check out our Substacks, links on abundancepod.com. But for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.